Chapter 7, Spymaster at Work, in which Washington proves to be a master of deception, and help comes from a surprising source. Something was stirring in New York City. As the summer of 1777 was ending, thousands of redcoats were acting as if they were leaving. Where were they going? Nathaniel Sackett, who, you will recall, was handpicked by Washington to run a spy network in New York, found exactly the right agent to get the answer. The British would trust her because she was the wife of a man gone over to the enemy. Because British food stocks were low, redcoats had taken grain from her. Sackett told her to go into the city, complain about the loss of her grain, and demand a hearing with General Sir William Howe, commander of the British forces. Meanwhile, she was to pick up all the information she could and then make her way back to Setauket, who was in Worcester County just outside New York. We do not know the agent's name, and we do not know if she got a hearing before Howe, but from a report Sackett later wrote, we know the most important facts she learned. The British were building many flat-bottomed boats and were planning to invade Philadelphia and subdue that city. Washington could slow down Howe, but his ragged army had little chance of keeping the British from sending troops from New York to occupy Philadelphia. Outnumbered nearly 2-1, Washington's army had 7,000 men, about 1,000 of them without shoes. Philadelphia, where the Continental Congress had created a new nation by drafting and signing the Declaration of Independence in July 1776, was doomed. Congressmen fled to York, Pennsylvania. On September 26, 1777, the British, under Howe, marched into Philadelphia. Washington made camp at White Marsh, about 12 miles northwest of Philadelphia, and planned his next move. Thanks to the advance work of Sackett and his woman agent, Washington already had a spy network set up in Philadelphia. Some agents he ran personally, and some worked under Major John Clark, a brilliant Continental Army officer on spy service. Our information on what was happening in and around Philadelphia comes from Washington's reports, letters and diaries, and from family stories handed down generation to generation. Just as Washington himself had to put the whole intelligence and counterintelligence picture together from bits of information, so must we. Piecing our bits together, we get a picture of the Philadelphia spy story. One of the key pieces of the story is Washington's use of deception. He seemed to enjoy fooling the British right from the beginning. Soon after taking command of the Continental Army in July 1775, for example, he learned that his soldiers had only 36 barrels of gunpowder, about 9 shots for each man. He sent agents into British-occupied Boston with the story that his army had 1,800 barrels, and, to raise morale, he had the same reports planted among his own men. Several times during the war, Washington arranged for fake documents to fall into the hands of known British spies. He set up the deception so that British scouts stopped his horseback couriers and grabbed the fake documents, thinking they were real. Or he had British riders stopped and their saddlebags examined. The contents of the saddlebags were then returned, along with documents that had been created by Washington's men, but that looked like real British documents. Spies are often good counterfeiters. One of the most complicated deceptions Washington ever put together came after Howe occupied Philadelphia. Washington knew that his men in White Marsh would be overwhelmed if the British sent troops from both New York and Philadelphia. But Washington also knew that Gates's victory over the British at Saratoga, less than a month after the British occupied Philadelphia, worried Howe and Clinton, now in charge of the British troops in New York, for they had no idea where Gates would strike next. Washington wanted Howe to think that Gates's army was heading for Philadelphia, which meant Howe had to keep his redcoats in that city, and to keep the British pinned down in New York City, Washington wanted Clinton to think that Gates's troops were on their way there. In fact, Gates was not sure what to do and did not go to either city. As part of the deception, Washington ordered 3 generals with troops near New York to act as if they were preparing to invade the city. They were also told to make sure that their secret moves became known to persons who you are sure will divulge those secrets. Those persons were New York Tories who were being fed false information, disinformation, and spy talk by American counterintelligence spies. For Philadelphia, part of the deception, Washington brought in Major Clark and told him to have one of his agents appear to become a traitor. Among his agents found one who agreed to go to Howe and offer his risk my all in procuring him intelligence. Howe, cautious about dealing with a traitor, asked to see what the man had to offer. He brought Howe a stack of documents, some written by Washington just for the deception. Among them was a paper showing that Gates was sending 8,000 men to help Washington capture Philadelphia. Howe fell for the deception, long enough for Washington to dig in at Whitemarsh and for Major Clark to train his agents. Major Clark, as director of the most important Philadelphia spy network, gave many of his agents the cover of farmer or merchant. The British allowed these people to pass in and out of Philadelphia because they were helping to feed the city. Other agents moved in and out under the cover of smugglers. They were allowed to pass because they could supply British officers with scarce goods. The comings and goings of all these privileged Philadelphians violated Washington's strict order against allowing such travel, but of course, his counterintelligence officers ignored the order, so the proper persons could get their reports to Clark. Legend says that some agents did not take their information directly to the American encampment at Whitemarsh, but instead passed it on to a woman known as Old Mom Rinker. She was said to have a unique way of getting the information to the next stop on the spy underground. She bleached her flax on a rock atop a cliff in Wissahickon Valley in Germantown, which is now part of Philadelphia. Nearby was her family's inn, Buck's Tavern, where Washington once set up overnight headquarters. She often sat on her rock knitting. A patriot guerrilla force called the Green Boys watched over the area, and at least one ambushed Hessian patrol. The Green Boys kept an eye on Old Mom, and when she accidentally dropped a ball of yarn over the cliff, they watched where it landed. After quickly retrieving it, they unrolled the yarn, removed the agent messages hidden inside, and took them to Washington's headquarters. Washington's deceptions kept Howe from attacking for a while, but deceptions cannot last forever. In November 1777, Howe began planning a battle that would defeat Washington so thoroughly that he would be forced to surrender, and the Revolutionary War would end in a major British victory. In Washington's words, a strong attack by Howe might prove the ruin of our cause. Howe's plan was upset not by one of Major Clark's agents, but by a woman who became a spy on her own. Lydia DeRoe and her family were living on 2nd Street in Philadelphia when British troops entered the city in September 1777. The mother of 4, she worked as a nurse, a midwife, and even as an undertaker to help support her family. Her husband, William, was a teacher, a strong, wise woman, 48 years old. She had come to America from Dublin, Ireland. She was a Quaker, as members of the Society of Friends were called. As such, she was believed to be against the war. She had been seen a neighboring family put out of their house. She had seen a neighboring family put out of their house when General Howe decided to set up his quarters there. So she was not surprised when Major John Andre, an officer on Howe's staff, ordered the DeRoe family out of their home. It was needed, he said, for British officers. She protested, saying she still had 2 children at home. Lydia decided to go to Howe and ask that her house not be taken. According to one story, Howe's headquarters, she spotted a British officer who was a second cousin from Ireland. He helped her talk Howe into letting her stay in her home, as long as she would let British officers use her living room, then called a parlor, for meetings. Lydia Deroe's career as a secret agent is not easy to track. Most information about her work comes down to us from her daughter, Anne. At some point, apparently as a lone volunteer without training, Lydia decided to snoop around. She sent whatever she and other family members learned to her son, Lieutenant Charles Deroe, who was in Washington's army at White Marsh. Her husband first wrote the information in a kind of family code, or shorthand. Lydia put the tiny pieces of paper inside cloth-covered buttons. She then sewed the buttons on the coat of her 14-year-old son, John, an expert at getting through British lines. John made his way to Charles. John then cut off his buttons and handed them to Charles, who took out the bits of paper and translated the shorthand messages for intelligence officers. We know now what Lydia did, but we still do not know what was in those tiny reports. On December 2nd, 1777, Major Andre told Lydia that he needed to use her parlor that night. All the family was to go to bed early, so that no one would be around when the officers met. The British arrived around 8 o'clock. Sensing that this was an important meeting, Lydia tiptoed to the locked door and listened. Another version has her hiding in a closet to eavesdrop. She heard Howe's top officers discussing what sounded like a plan for a surprise attack on Washington's army. Finally, she heard an officer reading the actual order for British troops to march from the city at dawn on December 4th and head for White Marsh. She slipped into her bedroom and made believe she was sleeping. After the meeting, Andre knocked on her door repeatedly until she sleepily answered. Convinced that she had not been wandering around during the secret conference, Andre went on his way. Meanwhile, on the first days of December, intelligence reports about British troops' movements began streaming into Washington's headquarters from various sources. On December 3rd, Major Clark gave Washington information only hours old. This morning, a sergeant, a countryman of my spies, assured him that the troops had received orders to hold themselves in readiness when called for, and to draw 2 days' provisions. Biscuit was served out to them when he came away, and 'twas the current language in the city among the troops and the citizens that they were going to make a move. Another source was Elias Bourdonnais, a delegate from New Jersey in the Continental Congress, who went into the army as a colonel and became superintendent of British prisoners of war. They may not sound like a job of an intelligence officer, but Bourdonnais could get information from his prisoners deliberately or accidentally, and as Washington later remarked, Bourdonnais had better opportunities than most other officers in the army to obtain knowledge of the enemy's situation, motions, and designs. Washington left to our imagination exactly how Bourdonnais must have spied on his prisoners. He probably eavesdrops on their conversations, or perhaps he turned some so they would betray their comrades in exchange for extra privileges. Whatever Bourdonnais' duties as supervisor of prisoners, he was certainly working in intelligence on December 3rd when Lydia left her house, went to the Howe's headquarters, and asked her cousin for a pass so that she could go to the flour mill outside the city. Family legend has her trudging through the snow carrying an empty flour sack. According to her daughter, Anne, shortly before Lydia reached the Rising Sun Tavern north of Philadelphia, she met a member of the Pennsylvania militia and told him that she had heard what she had heard the night before. He said he would take her report immediately to Washington. Long after the war, Bourdonnais told another story. He said that on December 3rd, he was in the Rising Sun Tavern, not far from the flour mill, collecting intelligence from a Philadelphia agent. A little, poor-looking, insignificant old woman came in and solicited leave to go into the country to buy some flour. He later wrote, "While we were asking some questions, she walked up to me and put into my hands a dirty old needle book with various small pockets in it. She then left the tavern. Bourdonnais searched through the book and found a piece of paper rolled up. On unrolling it, I found information that General Howe was coming out the next morning with 5,000 men, 13 pieces of cannon, baggage wagons, and 11 boats on wheels. On comparing this with other information, I found it to be true and immediately rode post to headquarters." What is the real story? We will never know. Whatever the details, some woman gave Washington vital information, and we also know that the Rising Sun Tavern, for a while, was a spy nest. Besides appearing in the Durow and Bourgonat stories, the tavern and another volunteer woman agent both found their way into a journal written by Benjamin Talmadge, Washington's intelligence chief. Talmadge tells about a country girl sent into Philadelphia supposedly to sell eggs, but told to obtain some information respecting the enemy. Talmadge was at a tavern called the Rising Sun, getting a report from the egg seller when he was warned that the British cavalry were nearby. Stepping to the door, he wrote, "I saw them at full speed chasing in my patrols." Talmadge leaped onto his saddle, hoisted up the woman, and galloped off. During a 3-mile ride, although there was considerable firing of pistols and not a little wheeling and charging, she remained unmoved, never once complained of fear. From countless trained and volunteer sources, including perhaps Lydia Durow, Old Mom, and the egg seller, Washington got enough information to spoil the British plan. By strengthening his forces at the places where he knew that Howe was about to attack, the master of deception made it look as if though reinforcements had arrived. Howe, believing reports that Washington had 4,000 additional troops, did not launch a major attack. He took his troops back to Philadelphia. Howe's intelligence officers firmly believed that someone had passed the British plan to Washington. According to Anne Durow, Major Andre returned to the Durow home and asked Lydia whether everyone had been asleep on the night of December 2nd. She convinced him that everyone had gone to bed early, and Andrea left saying, "One thing's for certain, the enemy had notice of our coming, and were prepared for us, and we marched back like a parcel of fools. The walls must have ears." Things stayed fairly quiet in Philadelphia until May, when General Sir Henry Clinton took over command of Philadelphia from General Howe. When Clinton learned that French troops had begun arriving in America, he realized he must return to New York. Suddenly, British customers were giving the laundries in Philadelphia rush orders to deliver clothing, finished or unfinished. Women agents who worked in the laundries passed the word. This is how Washington learned that the British were about to speedily depart. One of the officers who left Philadelphia when the British pulled out of the city in June 1778 was Major Andre. He would continue his job as a British spy master by running agents in New York, including Anne Bates, a former Philadelphia schoolteacher, who had left that city at the same time as the British. Sent into Washington's camp disguised as a peddler, she would bring solid reports on the number of cannon and the number of Continental troops, regiment by regiment. Washington put General Benedict Arnold in command of the American forces that entered Philadelphia after the British left. It would not be long before Major John Andre and General Benedict Arnold would meet.